Cumulative relative frequency tables. Let's start with frequency and work our way up to this very big term. Frequency is the number of times a data value occurs in a set. So here's a set of data, and frequency is usually charted in a frequency table. So this first line says that the data value 11 shows up twice in the data set. And the second row says that the data value 13 shows up 5 times. This is what frequency is, the number of times a value occurs. Relative frequency, then, is the ratio of the frequency to the total number of data values. So the same data set, the same frequencies, however, relative frequency adds this other column to the right side of the table and makes the ratio between the frequency of a certain data value to the total number of values. Now, cumulative relative frequency is the running total of all of the relative frequencies so far in a frequency distribution. So let's look at how this would work with the same relative frequency table. You can see that we've just added another column to the right-hand side with the title Cumulative Relative Frequency. So let's look at the first row. Since there are no relative frequencies before 0.10, that's the running total as of the first row. But now the second row is going to take that first row and that second row and add them together for a running total. Well, 0.10 and 0.25 is equal to 0.35. That goes in the cumulative relative frequency of the second row. Now for the data value 14, we're going to add the sum of the first two, 0.35, to the relative frequency of the data value for 14, which is 0.40. When we add these two together, we get 0.75. We're going to do the next thing, the exact same thing for the next row. Add 0.75 to the next relative frequency for the data value for 17. 0.75 plus 0.25 is equal to 1. And for all cumulative relative frequencies, they should always add up to 1 when you get to the last data value. So let's look at an example. You surveyed your class about how many siblings each student had. What percentage of the class has 5 or less siblings? Now you'll notice that our data is given in intervals here, but that's okay, because as long as we have the relative frequency, we can find the cumulative relative frequency. So the first row has been done. Since there are no data values below 0, the cumulative relative frequency is the same as the first relative frequency, 0.28. For the next row, we're going to add the first row and the second row's relative frequencies together. 0.28 plus 0.52 is equal to 0.80. So we're going to put that in the second row. To find the third row, we'll take what we've added already, 0.80, and add it to the next relative frequency, 0.16. When we add these two together, we get 0.96. And finally, we're going to add 0.96 to the last relative frequency, 0.04. And this should equal 1, and it does. But now we need to ask ourselves, have we answered the question? Well, we haven't yet, because the question asked what percentage of the class has 5 or less siblings. So if you look in the left-hand column on the number of siblings, you will see that the 4 to 5 range is the third row. So what we need is all of the relative frequencies of all of the data sets 5 or below. So if we go across to the cumulative relative frequency, we've added up all of the relative frequencies of all of these data points from 0 to 1, 2 to 3, and 4 to 5 right here. So 0.96 in percentage form is 96%. So now we've answered the question. 96% of the class has 5 or less siblings.